More importantly, tonight's topic, do we have reason to believe in God? Our first speaker, Dr. Ben Arbour, holds a PhD from the University of Bristol. His primary research interests lie at the intersection of contemporary analytical metaphysics and Christian theology. He is the author of more than 20 articles and book chapters that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as Philosophia Christi, the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, and Bibliotheca Sacra. His research on systematic metaphysics and the nature of time was funded by a $200,000 research grant by the John Templeton Foundation. He serves as a philosophical referee for numerous journals, including Philosophia Christi, the Australasian Journal for Philosophy and Religious Studies, which is published by Cambridge University. He is the editor of 3 books, including the most recently published Philosophical Essays Against Open Theism, Routledge 2018. He is a regularly sought-after conference speaker both here in the U.S. and abroad. When he's not focusing on analytical philosophy, Dr. Arbour enjoys spending time with his wife and 4 kiddos, as well as all things baseball. Speaking to Do We Have Reason to Believe in God, please welcome Dr. Ben Arbour.
Hi, everybody. I apologize, I don't have much of a voice tonight. I've been battling illness and was made aware earlier today that someone who frequents these events named Randall Theo is also recovering from strep throat. It's not fun to be sick, and since Randall and I don't see eye to eye on pretty much anything, I thought it might be good if we just opened in a word of prayer and prayed for Randall also to make a speedy recovery. So please, if you're a praying person, join me. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather today. We ask that you would, by your Spirit, open our eyes and our minds, that we would grasp the truth and that we would see it and be changed by it, and that we would all enjoy a nice, fun dialogue this evening. All this we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So I've been asked to speak to the question, do we have reason to believe in God? Yes. I've answered the question. You might not think there are any reasons to believe in God. Here are some. If God doesn't exist, what are all the churches for? Or, if God doesn't exist, who is Jesus' father? If God doesn't exist, where did Santa get his powers? Now, my friend Cameron likes to remind me that questions are not arguments. So here's a real, valid argument for the existence of God in the form modus ponens. Premise 1, if Christianity is true, then God exists. Premise 2, Christianity is true. Therefore, God exists. Now that's an argument. You might not like it. You might not think it's a good argument, but it's an argument. And it's a valid argument. It's a logical argument. And if you don't think it's a good argument because the first premise contains in the antecedent of the conditional what is in the consequent, then you would also have to reject an argument like this. If what we know from contemporary science is true, then the gravitational constant is the mass of one object times the mass of another object divided by the distance between them squared. Now, most people are going to say that's a perfectly good argument, or a perfectly good conditional anyway, and then they would go on to say what we know from contemporary science today is true. And therefore, you would be able to conclude that the gravitational constant is m1, m2 over d squared. Now, if that's a good argument, then my argument right here, if Christianity is true, then God exists, Christianity is true, therefore God exists, is a good argument. I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm just saying that it's an argument. And if it's an argument, and there's anyone who's persuaded by that argument, then that individual has a reason to believe in God. And that's the topic that we've been given tonight, right? do we have reason to believe in God? Now, my training as both a philosopher and a theologian is in the analytic tradition. And what we analytics like to do is get real clear on the meaning of terms to make sure that we're not talking past each other. So I propose that for this discussion that we're going to have tonight, not just between Mr. Jump and myself, but all of us together in this room, we just get real clear on what it is that we're talking about, because what it is that we're talking about is going to therefore make it clear what we're not talking about. So let's just think about these words. Do we have reason to believe in God? I propose that we first think about the word God. Who is God? Because if we're going to ask the question, do we have reason to believe in God, it makes sense for us to define what the object of our belief is and then figure out if we have reason to believe in that thing. Now, the God that I believe in is the God of what you might call historic Christianity. Now, this is Christianity, that the God who exists, there's only one God. There's not 10 gods, there's not 100 gods, there's only one God. And this one God created all things. And he even created mankind. Now, mankind rebelled against God and sinned, and therefore, Christians believe that we are rightfully deserving of God's judgment on us. But we also believe that God sent his Son into the world to right what was wrong and fix the stuff that was broken. I believe this, and this is the Christian God that I believe in. Okay? So Jesus is born of a virgin, he lives a sinless life, and he dies on a cross. He shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. And 3 days later, God raised him from the dead for our justification. This is what I believe. I believe this sincerely. I don't think it's just a cute story that we tell. I don't think it's a legend. I think it actually happened in history. Like George Washington was the first president of the United States. Jesus was born of a virgin. Same kind of historical fact on my worldview, okay? And I think all of you guys should believe that too. I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards. But that's not the topic of the debate tonight. The topic of the debate tonight is, do we have reason to believe in the Christian God? The topic of the debate is very clear. Do we have reason to believe in God? And since there's no specific religious tradition assigned to this God, it makes more sense for us to think about this whole topic. Do we have reason to believe in some supernatural supreme being as opposed to there is no supreme being? So the two options on the table are we have reason to believe in God or we don't have reason to believe in any God. Now, with that little bit in place, let's talk about the rest of the part of the question of the debate tonight. Do we have reason to believe in God? Who is the we? Do we have reason to believe in God? This is tricky. I don't know who the we is. I think there are lots of very reasonable ways to interpret this. We could mean like the royal we. Do we have reason to believe in God? Like, do I have reason? Yes, I have reasons to believe in God. But it could be like, do Mr. Jump and I have reason to believe in God? Or it could be, do we, in this room, people who are here tonight to think about this. It could mean, do we, people who think about this stuff and take time to be reflective on this. Or it could mean, do we, as in general humanity. I don't know. But I don't think a whole lot hinges on this, because I think everything that I have to say tonight is going to just go down the line, and it's going to be the same regardless of how we interpret the we. So, do we have reason? Well, what does it mean to have reason? Well, it could mean something like, is it reasonable to believe in God? Or do we have at least one reason, or do we have reasons? Are there multiple reasons to believe in God? But what does it mean to have reasons? It seems to imply some kind of possession, like I am in possession of a reason to believe in God. Now, here's what I think a reason is. A reason is something that for any belief that you have, if I ask you, do you believe that the New York Giants won the football game a minute ago? And you say yes. And then if I ask, why do you believe that? Then whatever you give me as a reason, that is a reason, okay? And it could be because I just watched it happen, right? Because the Buccaneers missed the field goal at the end, right? We got at least one person who's very excited about this. So I take it to be a reason is just any kind of justification that somebody could have for a belief. It doesn't guarantee that the belief is true. It doesn't mean that the belief is false. It doesn't mean that it's a good reason. It doesn't mean that it's a bad reason. It just means that it's a reason. So again, the debate topic tonight is, do we have any good reasons to believe in God? It's, do we have a reason? And in order to say, no, we don't have reason, then my opponent has the very difficult task of saying literally no one, when asked, why do you believe in God, can say, I believe in God because, and then fill in the blank with anything. But what does it mean to believe in God? Because our question is, do we have reason to believe in God? Now, for this evening, I think that the question, do we have reason to believe in God, is the same question as, do we have reason to believe that God exists? I think that's what we're really after tonight. It's not an epistemic question. It's ultimately an ontological or a metaphysical question, because there's a question about God. Does God exist? That is a metaphysical question. It's not an epistemological question. It's not a question about our minds. It's a question about whether or not God exists. However, the specifics of the question tonight, do we have a reason to believe that God exists, makes it an epistemological question about a metaphysical claim. Okay? That's a lot. So I just kind of want to unpack that for just a second. There's the question about whether or not God exists. That's a metaphysical claim. It is an ontological claim. I'm using those two terms synonymously. Whether or not God exists. But then there's the question of whether or not we have reason to believe that. That means our reasoning is an epistemological issue. It's a question of our minds. Do we have reason to believe that God exists? That's the question that I think we're really after tonight. And again, I think the answer to that question is obviously yes. There are lots of reasons to believe in God. Here's one. Bible says so. I sincerely think that's a good reason to believe that God exists. Like, I'm not trying to be cute. That's the Bible and the authority of the Scriptures is an important part of the way that I think that we should reason. But I recognize that there's a lot of people in here who aren't going to agree with that kind of reasoning. And that's okay. Well, it's not, but I mean, for the purpose of this discussion, it's okay, right? And I mean, I still want to be friends with you. It's not something that I think you're like a totally evil person, Hitler, Stalin-esque, because you don't believe the Bible. But it is a good reason. And just because somebody doesn't think it's a good reason doesn't mean that it's not a reason altogether. And that's the question tonight. The question, again, is not, do we have good reason to believe in God? The question is, do we have reason? So if you ask anybody, do you believe that God exists? And they say yes. And then you ask why, and they say, Bible says so. That's a reason. And since it's a reason, in the affirmative, yes, it is a reason, then that means the answer to the question tonight, do we have a reason to believe in God, is yes. So anybody who would say, no, we don't have reason, doesn't understand what reasons are. They don't understand what epistemic justification is. And they don't understand what's at issue in this conversation. Now, we might want to move on to something that's a lot more interesting. And it might be a lot more interesting to say, do we have good reasons to believe in God? And I think that that's a question worth really spending some time on. But it's not worth spending any time on the more interesting question of whether or not there are good reasons to believe in God until we can first get clear on the fact that absolutely yes, there are reasons to believe in God. In the interest of intellectual integrity, until we can get on the same page and say, yes, there are reasons to believe in God, I just don't think there are any good ones. If that's what my opponent wants to say, that's fine. But as soon as he says, yes, there are reasons to believe in God, well, the debate is settled. Because tonight, the debate topic was, do we have reason to believe in God? But I'm going to go ahead and just assume that Mr. Jump, who I've had the opportunity to dialogue with once before, is willing to concede that point, because he's a smart guy. I do think that we have good reasons to believe in God. There are lots of them. I'll just name a few. There's the Kalam cosmological argument. There's the Leibnizian cosmological argument. There's the argument from numbers, the argument from motion. There's the moral argument. There's the argument from consciousness, the argument from beauty, the argument from intentionality. There's the argument from possibility. There's Anselm's ontological argument. There's the Cartesian ontological argument. There are numerous modal ontological arguments, and some of my own recent research has been defending certain articulations of the modal ontological argument. And then there's my personal favorite. There's the argument from so many arguments. Now, in order for someone to say there are no good arguments for the existence of God, you would need to tell me what goes wrong with each one of those that I just mentioned. But I'm fairly confident that at least tonight, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty confident that I'm the only person who actually knows what all those arguments are, much less willing to actually talk about the ins and outs of the various moves of logic that are involved in them. So, unless someone is willing to say, no, that argument that you just mentioned right there, the argument from natural numbers, the reason that it goes wrong is for this reason, you're not in any epistemic position to tell me that there are no good arguments for the existence of God. Because that would mean that you have surveyed all of the arguments for God's existence, and you know all of them, and you know that none of them are good. This is a little bit like the person who goes and digs around in their backyard for a little while, and after digging 3 or 4 holes, finds no gold in any of the holes that they have dug, and therefore concludes, I've looked really hard across the entire state of Texas, and there's no gold there. It's a bit premature to know or claim to know that there's no gold in Texas because you investigated 1 or 2 little things. That's silly. But just so that we can get really clear on some things that Mr. Jump and I have talked about before, I'm going to very briefly sketch out one particular argument for the existence of God that I find compelling, and we would be able to talk about that more if we needed to. This is called the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's defended most prominently by a Christian philosopher by the name of William Lane Craig. I'm sure many of you in this room have heard of him. And William Lane Craig's a good guy. I like him a lot, and he's been very helpful to me. So everything I learned about this, I learned from him. There's not much that I know about the Kalam argument that didn't come from him, but it's a very simple argument. It starts with the first premise. Everything that begins to exist was caused to begin to exist. Okay? So if there is something that begins to exist, then it was caused to begin to exist. That's the first premise. The second premise is this: the universe began to exist. Now, this premise is not controversial to anybody who's paid attention to both science and philosophy. The science makes it quite clear that the universe began to exist. It's why we believe in Big Bang cosmology. Now, there's lots of reasons to believe this, but just a couple things would be pointing to the discovery of what we call red light shift. This is something that was discovered by the Hubble telescope after it got launched. Red light shift shows that the universe is expanding. And not only is it expanding, the rate at which the universe is expanding is accelerating. The universe is getting bigger faster. And the fact that it's expanding leads us to believe that at some point it was originate in a single point. And cosmologists will sometimes refer to that as the singularity. So science supports this, but philosophy also supports it. We don't think that there can be something like an actual infinite. If there was something that could be actually infinite, you're going to have all kinds of puzzles that cannot be solved in the way of basic mathematics. So if you imagine that there's a library with an infinite number of books, and it has an infinite number of black books and an infinite number of red books. So how many total books in the library? An infinite number, good. And how many black books? How many red books? Okay, so you want to do some light weekend reading, you check out all the red books. How many books do you check out? How many books are left in the library when you take the red books out? Now that doesn't work, because I learned that any number minus itself equals 0, right? Now, when you're done with your reading, and there's just the black books that are left in the library, and you have all the red books, how many books are there in the library before you return any? And then when you return the red books, how many books are in there? Well, that can't be, because I learned that any number plus itself is not the same number. Now, these kinds of very simple puzzles about infinity have demonstrated that the universe cannot have existed forever. But even if those puzzles could be solved, there are other puzzles that demonstrate that the universe couldn't be infinite, because there'd be no way to traverse an actual infinite. There's no way for us to actually get to this point. If the universe had existed forever and ever and ever, and the arrow of time is moving forward, how would we have ever gotten to this particular point? It's not possible. Moreover, if you believe in any of the silly tales about oscillating models of the universe where it expands and then contracts and expands and it contracts, you have to violate all kinds of rules that we know from science, like the laws of thermodynamics, which teach that an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. We all learned that, right? Or the law of entropy, which says that things tend towards a state of disorder. If the universe had been around for an infinite period of time, we would have already arrived at a place of total equilibrium. But we're not there. There's still concentrations of energy. So there's no way that the universe has existed forever. So, again, premise 1, for all things that begin to exist, for all things that begin to exist, they are caused to begin to exist. The universe began to exist. We got lots of reasons for believing that. Therefore, we conclude the universe was caused to begin to exist. And then we just need to ask the question, what could possibly be the cause of the beginning of the universe? Well, whatever it is, it has to be extremely powerful. And when we look at the way that the universe is organized, whatever being is responsible for the creation of the universe must be incredibly wise to organize things in the way they are. Because we're not only fine-tuned for life, we're fine-tuned for discoverability. And that we would be able to think about any of these things is truly remarkable. Now, I don't know what you want to call it, but a being that's really powerful and extremely wise, that's responsible for the creation of the universe, I don't have any problem calling that being God. Now, maybe you want to call it a computer, or maybe you want to call it something else, and at that point I think we're just doing a semantic word game. There are other reasons that I could give as to why that being that's extremely powerful and extremely wise and exists of necessity is also a personal being, meaning that it has a will and a consciousness and makes decisions. But I'm worried that I'm about out of time, and maybe we could talk about that a little bit more during the Q&A and so on and so forth. So let me just recap what we've said. The question tonight is, do we have reason to believe in God? The question is not, do we have good reasons to believe in God? The question is, do we have reason to believe in God? And the obvious answer to this is yes. Anyone who says no is just not thinking about the nature of the question and what it means to have reason for a belief. So if we can get past that, then we can move on to the more interesting discussion as to whether or not we have good reasons to believe that God exists. But I don't see any reason to progress until we can at least get clear that obviously, yes, we have reason to believe in God. Thank you.
Dr. Ben Arbour, one more time. Our next speaker is making his debut at the BNBC. TJump is an atheist who created a YouTube channel. And I don't recognize you without your headset on.
And the chair too, right?
And the lazy boy, yeah. YouTube channel called TJump, where he debates professors, philosophers, and expert theologians on reasons to believe in God. He has debated people such as Paul Copan, Peter Hitchens, Clay Jones, and Robin Collins. His approach is based on the epistemology and model of morality he wrote and is working towards publishing. Speaking again to the topic, do we have reason to believe in God? Please welcome TJump.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate all of you coming out and showing, and I appreciate the Bible and Beer Consortium for hosting this and inviting me. So a round of applause for all you guys for coming out tonight. Thanks. So the question tonight is there reason to believe in God? And my opponent made a compelling case that reasons could just be any reason. We could just make up reasons. Well, the Bible says so. Well, in the book of Pastafarianism, it says the spaghetti monster exists. Is that a reason to believe the spaghetti monster exists? I would say probably not. So when we refer to reasons, we usually mean good reasons implicitly. We don't just mean any reason we could just make up. So when we ask, are there reasons to believe in a God, we do in fact mean good reasons. We're not just talking about anything. So my opponent is correct that we are asking the question, is there any good reason? But I would argue that if it's not a good reason, then it's really not a reason we should believe it in the first place. And I would say, are there any good or any reasons at all to believe in a God? No. Just asserting anything doesn't work, and all of the evidence and arguments presented in order to indicate a God can be equally explained by non-God alternatives, like naturalistic things. My preferred alternative is called naturalistic pantheism. Just an eternal, all-powerful nature, no mind, no consciousness, no personality to it. We can explain everything just by saying nature is eternal. We don't need a God there. In addition, there are many reasons that certain kinds of gods can't exist. Like we know that gods can be self-contradictory in certain ways, especially if they have certain kinds of properties. So those kinds of gods we can completely rule out as existing at all. Now, the biggest misconception most theists have is that they believe that God is special, that only God can explain the origin of the universe, or only God can explain the fine-tuning, or only God can explain the basis of objective morality. And my biggest goal tonight is to show you that that's not the case. Anything that can be explained by a God can be explained by unknown natural causes. Anybody can make up an answer to the origin of the universe, or can make up an answer to the origin of morality or the fine-tuning. It's not really... Oh, shoot, sorry, I lost my spot there. For example, all of the individual and collective arguments they listed at the beginning can be explained equally as well by a non-God as by an actual God, which means they don't actually indicate a God. For example, think about it this way. Imagine you have a box, and this box weighs 2 pounds. If someone said there is a rabbit in the box, and my evidence for this rabbit is the fact that the box weighs 2 pounds, well, is the 2 pounds actually evidence of a rabbit? Well, no, because the 2 pounds could be explained by a lizard, or a coffee mug, or a weight, or many, many other things. So the fact the box weighs 2 pounds isn't actually evidence of a rabbit. And the same thing applies to arguments for the existence of God. Even though they could be explained by a God, because they could also be explained by many other things, they aren't actually evidence of a God, and so they aren't reasons to believe in a God. But what if I said, it's not a rabbit in the box, it's a leprechaun in the box? The 2 pounds is explained by a 2-pound leprechaun in the box. Could there be such a thing as a 2-pound leprechaun? Sure, maybe. I can't say there can't be. But the 2 pounds in the box isn't evidence of a leprechaun just because it could be explained by a leprechaun. You need something more. God is the same kind of a thing. If you want to assert that the universe was created by a God, or explains the fine-tuning, or explains morality just because it could, that's not evidence of a God. That's just evidence there's something we can't explain, which you can assert a God as an answer to. Arguments and evidence are like a compass. We try to use them to point in the direction of truth, and if you have a compass that you think points north, all I have to do to show that the compass is broken is shake it a little bit and show the same argument can point the other direction, which means it doesn't actually indicate that whatever direction you think it's pointing is in fact north, because it can be used, the same compass can be used to point in the opposite direction. So it's not a reliable guide to truth, it's just a broken compass. So if you think the 2 pounds in the box indicates a leprechaun, all I have to do to show it's not evidence of a leprechaun is say, well, no, the 2 pounds can be explained by a rabbit. Arguments and evidence for God work the same way. If you think they indicate a God, all I have to do to show they don't is show that the same arguments can be explained by a non-God alternative. For example, what caused the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning, objective morality? These can all be explained by a God, but they could also be explained by an unknown natural thing, or pantheism, the spaghetti monster, dicetheism, all these different alternatives. Just like the 2 pounds in the box could be explained by a rabbit, or a lizard, or a 2-pound leprechaun, or a unicorn, or any kinds of things. So, All of these arguments are broken compasses. They can be used to indicate a God, but they can also be used to indicate pretty much anything else. They're just arguments that we don't know the answer to which a God has been slapped on as a solution. They don't actually indicate a God. They're not reasons to believe in a God. Could it be a leprechaun? Could it be a God? Sure. Is that reason to believe in a leprechaun or a God? No. So what is evidence? Evidence is anything that can be used to differentiate an imaginary thing from the real existing thing. And whatever can do this is evidence. Doesn't matter if it's natural, supernatural, makes predictions, falsifiability, ubernatural, don't care. Anything that can differentiate between the real and the imaginary, that's evidence. So, and there can only be one ultimate truth. So, I mean, I don't think two mutually exclusive things can be true at the same time. Not a intuitionist in that way. So, of all the things I listed, like theism, deism, Pastafarianism, pantheism, only one of these can be true, and everything else is imaginary. And so if whatever evidence you present can be, to indicate theism, can also be used to indicate all of those alternatives, then those arguments don't differentiate between the real thing and the imaginary things. It can't tell the difference between the two. And if it can't tell the difference between the imaginary and the real, then it's not evidence. Because remember, evidence is just anything that can differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. So if all the arguments and evidence presented by my opponent can be shown to indicate a non-God as well as they indicate his God, well then they're not actually evidence of a God, are they? And that's exactly what theism has done. It tries to show that evidence of a God by answering questions we just don't know the answer to. Like what caused the origin of the universe? The Kalam cosmological argument. We don't know. Could it be a God? Absolutely. But it could also be a non-God. So is this evidence of a God? Is this a reason to believe in a God? Well, no, just like it's not reasonable to believe that just because there's a 2-pound box and we don't know what's inside, that's evidence of a leprechaun. Clearly not. Now, there could be a supernatural out there. I can't say there isn't, and I can't say what its limitations are. I can't say the supernatural can't do X, Y, and Z because we haven't discovered it yet. It would be a contradiction to say, well, we haven't discovered it, but it can't do this. That would be like saying, oh, look, an unidentified flying object. Oh, it must be aliens. You can't identify it as aliens if it's an unidentified flying object. It's a contradiction. But the same thing that applies to the supernatural also applies to the unknown natural. Just like the supernatural hasn't been discovered and we don't know what it can do, we haven't discovered the unknown natural, and there's a lot of unknown things out there that we haven't discovered. So just like I can't say the supernatural can't do X, Y, and Z, the theist can't say the unknown natural can't do X, Y, and Z. So just like a God could explain an objective basis of morality, there could be an undiscovered law of nature out there that explains objective basis of morality that we just haven't discovered yet. We have no idea. Therefore, anything the supernatural can explain, the unknown natural can also explain. In other words, anything a God can explain can be explained by unknown naturalistic forces. So what was before the Big Bang? What caused the fine-tuning? What caused objective morality? Anyone can make up answers to these questions, both theists and atheists, scientists, secularists, anybody. But the correct answer is we don't know. Science is the best we have to show the difference between a real and imaginary things. It is the best form of evidence. And science doesn't provide answers to what caused the fine-tuning, what's the origin of the universe. It doesn't give us any evidence to answer those questions or what's behind the Big Bang. So the correct answer is we don't know. We should just stop there. The reason science doesn't have answers for these questions is because science is limited to only talk about things that we can demonstrate are non-imaginary, that they're the real things. You can differentiate between the imaginary and the real things, and those are the only things it's allowed to talk about. There is no combination of known principles, particles, and laws in the terms of physics that can get us omni-properties that a God has, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, whatever. There's nothing in physics, no combination of those things that can lead us to those properties. So science is not allowed to use them in their explanations. This isn't because science can't use them. A scientist could at any point just add these to a theory and they say like, general relativity is all-powerful and eternal, therefore it explains everything and we don't need an origin to the universe because, well, general relativity is just outside of space and time. So, okay, there we go. Problem solved. Add omni-properties to a scientific theory, and now it can explain the cosmological argument. Not a problem. Or we can say quantum mechanics has this undiscovered magical omni-benevolent property, and so it's explained objective morality just by using that. Scientists could at any point add these omni-properties to scientific theories to answer the same questions that theists have proposed to answer with their God. The reason they don't is the same reason they don't add fairies and magic and unicorns and space aliens to scientific theories, because there's no way to differentiate those things from imaginary things. If we were allowed to just add these into any theory, we could explain anything, but because there's no way to differentiate them from imaginary things, there's no actually evidence to support it, and science only uses things that we can differentiate between the imaginary and the real. So anything theology can answer, science can answer. Science just chooses not to because it prefers not to make stuff up and just accepts the we don't know answer. The major weakness of religious apologetics is that the methodology and arguments apologists use can be equally used to support any metaphysical theory of everything that has omni properties. So that would mean like pandeism, cosmism, panpsychism, transtheism, polytheism, pastafarianism, evil God, naturalistic pantheism. There are just infinitely many of these things. You don't need a God to explain anything. Now, again, only one of these can be the truth, and the rest are imaginary. And because none of the evidence or arguments religious apologists use can provide a way to differentiate between which is real and which of the infinitely many imaginary things are imaginary, then it's not evidence of a God. It's not evidence that can tell us what's true from what's just imaginary. The reason we trust science is because it can. It can differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. And so what's before the Big Bang? What caused the fine-tuning? What caused objective morality? We don't know. Science does not give us answers to these questions yet, so we don't have a way to differentiate between what is the truth to these answers and which one of us, what have we just made up in our heads and are imaginary. As a final note, we have good reason to believe the Christian God specifically does not exist, because if an all-good, all-powerful God did exist, then it would have created a world without involuntary suffering. If it is immoral to force people to live in a world without their consent, we did not give consent to live in this world. We kind of just showed up here. And so if a God created even one person and placed them here without consent, it would necessarily be slavery and necessarily be immoral. The definition of slavery is a person owned by someone else, under their control of someone else, forced to work for someone else's purposes without consent. A slave is considered property of another, as the one controlling them purchases them or owns them, like from if we were created by a God and owned by him. That would be the definition of slavery, which is necessarily immoral. So if we were forced to choose to live in, or if we were forced into this world without the ability to choose, that would necessarily be slavery to this God's purposes that we didn't get a consenting in, which would necessarily be immoral. Or another option would be if we're forced to choose between heaven and hell without our consent and we don't have the option to opt out of either of these things, that would also be immoral and would also be making a all-good God impossible. So in conclusion, there are no good reasons to believe in a God, just like there's no good reason to believe in Zeus or leprechauns or fairies, because all those things are just asserted to explain something we just don't know the answer to yet. Could it be a God? Absolutely. Is that reason to believe in a God? No. Just like it's not reason to believe that the 2-pound box is explained by a leprechaun. If we are allowed to add unsupported properties like omni properties, anything theology can answer, so can secular science. Not a problem. And if we're not allowed to add unsupported properties like omni properties, then theology doesn't really provide any answers to anything. In fact, that's all theology does, is it just leverages these properties that we can't support of all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good to explain things that we just don't know the answer to. Science just admits we don't know. That's the difference. If adding omni properties was a reasonable way to gain knowledge, scientists would do it. The reason they don't is because it's not. And finally, if there was an all-good, all-powerful God, it would have given each of us the option to live in this universe that was created by God, or the option to opt out. And the fact that it didn't means there must necessarily not be an all-good God. Thank you.
TJump. Each speaker will now begin a 15-minute rebuttal. We'll begin with Dr. Arbour.
Let me see if I can lower this a little bit. Just a little bit. Okay, a couple of quick things. Mr. Jump said that I know, I'm sorry that I don't know the book here, whatever the religious literature of the Pastafarian faith is, that book instructs its adherents that the flying spaghetti monster exists. Does this give them a reason for believing in the flying spaghetti monster? Obviously, yes. Yes. Like, it's not even a question. The fact that we would want to say no just goes to show we're not dealing with the same understanding of epistemic justification. Justification is really easy to get. When somebody asks, why do you believe this? If you can give them any reason at all, it doesn't have to be a good reason. You're justified in believing that. Just because you're justified in believing something doesn't mean that you're being perfectly rational. And it doesn't mean that what you're believing is true, but you can be epistemically justified in believing false things. So, of course. Now, he also, right at the very beginning, said, so the more important question is, are there any good reasons, or are there any reasons at all? And I'm not sure which one he wants us to talk about. Yes, there are good reasons to believe in God, but he also puts on the table, are there any reasons at all? Of course. The answer is yes to both of these. And I think we should just get clear on what we are or are not talking about. Now, Mr. Jump likes to talk about naturalistic pantheism. I would just remind everyone that the word pantheism has the word theism in it, so it is a kind of theism. Naturalistic pantheism is most associated with the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. He was a Jewish philosopher who wrote some very, very important work. He wrote in the geometric method at the early stages of modern philosophy, and his ethics are often called naturalized ethics because, well, he was excommunicated from his synagogue because the kind of God that he posited was that the universe was itself God. That's not the same thing as there is no God. He just supernaturalized the universe. That's not the same thing as saying there is no such thing as the supernatural. And calling something naturalized supernaturalism or naturalized pantheism is a contradiction in terms, even if somebody might want to use it in a clever way. Now, Mr. Jump also said at numerous places that lots of things can be explained by unknown natural causes. It's not at all clear to me how that which is unknown can explain anything. If it's not known, it cannot do the work of explaining something. You have to know that it exists, and then you can point to that thing over there is the explanation of that other thing over there. It's not an explanation to say, there's something out there that explains that. That's a hypothesis. It's not an explanation. That's not the way that these things work. Now, it's also important that we understand that with respect to explanation, you can have multiple, independent, mutually exclusive hypotheses that are supported by the same set of evidence. So the 2-pound box, maybe it's a rabbit, maybe it's a leprechaun. Okay, that's fine. But it can give you reason to believe something because all that evidence is it raises the likelihood that what you believe is true. There's a hypothesis, okay? Suppose that we have this box, and in the box is a 2-pound object. You know that the rabbit in question that you have weighs 2 pounds. You also know that a leprechaun weighs 2 pounds. Well, you know that whatever the object in the box is doesn't weigh 3 pounds, and it doesn't weigh 1 pound. It weighs 2 pounds. Does that raise the likelihood that what's in the box is a rabbit? Yes. So does it give you a reason for believing that what's in the box is a rabbit? Yes. Does it also give you a reason for believing that what's in the box is a leprechaun? Yes again. Is it possible that what is in the box is both a rabbit and a leprechaun? No, I'm not suggesting that there's some contradiction here. I'm saying that evidence can support multiple hypotheses at the same time and raise the likelihood that what you believe is true. It doesn't guarantee it. It doesn't raise it to a level of 100% certainty, but 100% certainty doesn't exist for almost anything in life. We cannot have Cartesian certainty about much of anything in our life. Now, there's this thing called God of the gaps styled reasoning, that when a scientist comes across something and is trying to explain some phenomena and can't explain it on the basis of any natural causes, they might say, well, it must be God. That's not a bad inference, because what science teaches us to do is reason and make inferences to the best explanation. If God is the best explanation of something, for all we know, it doesn't mean that it will forever and always remain that case. We might make some later discovery that says, oh, as it turns out, I don't need to appeal to God in order to explain some particular phenomena. But as best we know right now, it sure seems like the best explanation would be God. And saying, well, there's something unknown that's natural and eventually we'll figure it out and justify that. That's not a God of the gaps style reasoning. That's called a science of the gaps style reasoning. And it's a kind of faith. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if it's not to be admitted on the part of the theist to make a God of the gap style reasoning, then it certainly also should not be admitted for the atheist or the agnostic to appeal to something unknown to do any explanatory work. Now, we also have this question of pantheism or the unknown or the spaghetti monster or all these things. In certain places, the flying spaghetti monster, if the flying spaghetti monster really is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, is just another name for God. And it's a cute and clever way for atheists to try to pretend like they don't understand what we're talking about, when in reality they do. Mr. Jump's definition of evidence, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but I hope I am. Evidence is that which can be used to differentiate between what is real and what is imaginary. Okay, I don't think that I have any problem with that definition. It's not a standard definition that's used in any of the philosophical literature about evidence amongst evidentialists. Now, I'm not an evidentialist, just so we're clear. I don't think that your belief in God has to be grounded in all these reasons in order for you to be rationally justified. I think it's perfectly reasonable if somebody asks me, Ben, why do you believe in God? For me just to say, because it seems like God exists. I think that's rational. I think it's justified. I think that's warranted. This is what Alvin Plantinga's religious epistemology that got him elected the president of the American Philosophical Association, right? No slouch here. And I think that that's perfectly rational. So to talk about the way that evidence helps us differentiate between what's real and what's not, I'm willing to play this game for a few minutes, but that doesn't commit me to being an evidentialist about whether or not somebody can be rationally justified in believing in God. But there's another example that I just want to give, and this example comes from Trent Doherty, who's leading epistemologist, very, very well published, and he himself is an evidentialist, right? So I take no credit for this thought experiment, but let's just imagine that I've got 4 people here in front of me, right? And I've got one fair 6-sided die, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 4 people each bet on what's going to come up. One person bets 1, the second person bets 2, the third person bets 3, and the fourth person bets 5. Okay? So we have bets on 1, 2, 3, and 5. And suppose that I go off into the corner and I roll the die and I look at it and then I come back and I announce to everyone, good news, the die has rolled and it came up with a prime number. Okay, let's just rehearse our prime numbers 1 through 6. 1 is prime, 2 is prime, 3 is prime, 4 is not prime, 5 is prime, 6 is not prime. Okay, so everyone's still in it, right? Does anyone now have reason to believe that they were right? Yes. All of them have reason because we've ruled out 2 of the numbers. They had a 1 in 6 chance, now they have a 1 in 4 chance. It doesn't guarantee that they're right, but the likelihood that what they bet on is true went up. They got evidence. Now, this evidence is helping them to differentiate between what is real and what is imaginary, but it's not guaranteeing one and only one particular outcome. Because again, evidence can support multiple, distinct, independent, mutually exclusive hypotheses and not give you Cartesian certainty about something. Now, if I go back and I look at it again and I come out and I say, hey, I have other news. The number that is rolled is less than 3, okay? So the person who bet on 3 and the person who bet on 5 have been eliminated. Now it's just 1 and 2. Do these people have reason to believe that they were right? Yes, because again, they've been given evidence that what they think is true is more likely than not. It started off as 1 out of 6, then it went to 1 out of 4, and now they got a 50-50 shot. So to deny that that kind of thing is evidence is just to fundamentally misunderstand what's going on epistemologically. The same would also be true with respect to quantum mechanics. There are like 9 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Some of these have been ruled out by the Bell experiments. Or some people think that they have. Others are not quite so sure. But these 9 different interpretations of quantum mechanics, there's no way that all of them can be true at the same time. But do you know what all of them do show conclusively? That Newtonian understandings of causation are not true all the way down at subatomic levels. Okay? So evidence doesn't necessarily guarantee you one and only one particular outcome, but it certainly does rule out many. So again, I just want to say, Mr. Jump wants to criticize the theist for saying that God, which he claims is unidentified, can't do any explanatory work because it has not been identified, right? You can't look at an unidentified flying object and say, look, it's aliens, because it's not identified, therefore it can't do that work. But he seems quite content to talk about all these unknown naturalistic explanations that he thinks can do the exact same amount of work in explaining the Kalam cosmological argument. And that's just not going to work. You don't get that for free. You can have it one way or the other, but not both. And finally, and I won't make the argument here, but for those who have ears to hear, Mr. Jump was very happy to say, could it be a God? And his response was, absolutely. Could God be the explanation of all this? Absolutely. So he seems to concede that it's possible that God could be the explanation of all these things. But if it is possible that God exists, God exists.
Yeah. "15-minute rebuttal. Tom Jump.
All right, I'm going to jump right in here. Lots to cover. So Dr. Arbour said that pantheism has the word theism in it, therefore it's a kind of theism. Now this is going to come to a big surprise to my fellow atheists because atheism also has the word theism in it. So apparently we believe in a God, we just didn't know it. I didn't come up with the term naturalistic pantheism. It's not mine. It comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can just Google pantheism under the section, in like section 6, it has naturalistic pantheism, which is a kind of physicalism, where the only thing entailed is the ontological commitments of science. And in section 6, it specifically says, pantheism has no personality to it, no mind, no consciousness. It's one of the fundamental aspects of pantheism. So, I mean, this has nothing to do with me. I did not make up this term. You got to take this up with them. So, I don't know. I don't know what you're going for there. He said there's a naturalism of the gaps. It's like if you say, well, we label this, we don't know what's causing this. If we say it's a natural thing, we're just going to discover it in the future, well, that's a naturalism of the gaps. Well, I hate to break it to you, there's no such thing as a naturalism of the gaps. If you see white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, and there's a blank, well, what's in that blank? It's probably going to be a white goose. You know, if you say white goose, that's fine. It's not a white goose of the gaps, it's just induction. If you say black goose, and it's something out of the ordinary, well, then it's a black goose of the gaps. But everything in history, when you said we don't know what caused this, what is it? We've discovered it's a natural cause, natural cause, natural cause, natural cause, natural cause. So the next reasonable inference is the next one unknown to discover is also going to be a natural cause. That's not naturalism of the gaps, that's induction. If you say it's natural cause, natural cause, natural cause, natural cause, and the next one's going to be a supernatural cause, that's a supernatural God of the gaps. So there's no such thing as the naturalism of the gaps, that's just induction. He said you can have evidence that supports mutually exclusive possibilities. That's true, but that wasn't my argument. I said that if you say there's a 2-pound box, it's not any more evidence of a rabbit than it is of a lizard. So it does not indicate a rabbit more than it indicates a lizard. And in the context of a God, as Dr. Arbour mentioned in his introduction, there are only 2 possibilities, God or no God. And since the same evidence can be worked for a God, like theism, or a non-God, like pantheism, then it works equally well for God exists as it does for God does not exist. So it's not evidence for God, it's not evidence for anything. We just don't know. Dr. Arbour mentioned that it's unfair of me to say that there could be some unknown natural cause for things that we just don't know yet. And he's using an unknown God thing, and I criticize that, so how could I must be a hypocrite for using an unknown natural cause. Well, that's actually kind of my point. We can both make stuff up. I'm not saying an unknown natural cause is a good explanation. I'm just saying if you want to make stuff up, so can we. Scientists just don't choose to do that. So I'm not actually advocating for this as a good methodology. I'm just demonstrating we can do it too. We just choose not to. His main argument, he said that the good reason we have to believe in a God is the Kalam cosmological argument. This is very surprising, but I'll go with it. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. Absolutely agree. Is that a cause of God? No. It could be, sure, but it could also be a non-God. So the argument works equally as well for a God as it does for a non-God. So we have a 2-pound box. Could it be a leprechaun? Sure. Could it be a rabbit? Sure. Is it evidence of a leprechaun more than it's evidence of a rabbit? Nope. And so, no, that's not actually a reason to believe in a God. There's no evidence there at all. He mentioned the infinite regress problem. He said that there's this contradiction where if you have a number and you subtract it from itself, it always equals 0. And if you have an infinite number of things and you subtract an infinite, you still have an infinite. Well, infinite isn't a number. It's a property of a set. You can just Google it. Is infinite a number? And the answer is no. It's not a number. It's more like a variable, kind of like x. You can subtract x from x and get different things if you're using 2 different x's. Like if I have one x set as 1 and one x set at 4, and I subtract 1 from 4, I get 3. Is that a contradiction? Well, no. X isn't a number. It's a variable. Infinite is the same kind of thing. It describes the properties of a set, and there can be different sizes of infinites. So if you subtract one infinite from another, you can get different results, just like if you subtract one x from another, you can get different results. And if you're curious, this is called Cantor's diagonal proof. It shows that there's different sizes of infinites, so you can actually add and subtract them and get different numbers, no problem. He mentioned that in order for there to be a cyclic universe, you would have to violate the laws of physics like the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy. Well, that's interesting. I think he may have forgotten the first law of thermodynamics, which is energy cannot be created or destroyed. So if you believe in a God, well, that would also have to violate the laws of physics, namely the first one. So it seems like there's a double standard here. Apparently the laws of physics don't apply to a God, but we can't assert that there's an unknown natural thing that doesn't apply to the laws of physics. Apparently, the laws of physics apply to all natural things, both known and unknown. Oh, but God gets a pass. Well, no. As Dr. Barber mentioned, either it has to be both or neither. Either we can both assert things that are outside of the laws of physics, or we neither can. And so if he wants to assert there's something outside of the laws of physics like a God, I can just assert there's something outside of the laws of physics like an undiscovered natural thing. So if you want exceptions to the laws of physics, I get them too. Either both or neither. I think that covers most of it. Yeah, I think I'm good. I think I got all those points. Thanks. Awesome. All right, so you said the God of the gaps was a good argument.
No. I said that God of the gaps reasoning can sometimes be an inference to the best explanation.
How could a God be the best explanation?
Because if there are no natural explanons of some particular phenomena, and it doesn't look like any natural explanons can do the work of justifying the existence of whatever particular phenomena in question we're observing, then it might make sense to conclude that there is a supernatural explanon.
So it sounds to me like you said the natural can't do it, therefore supernatural.
I didn't say that. I said if it appears that way. I didn't say that the natural cannot. I said if there is a situation in which we are looking and it appears that the natural lacks the resources to explain some particular phenomena, then it could be rational to make an inference to the best explanation that the cause is not natural. There's a lot of ifs, there's a lot of conditionals there. I didn't say science can't do it. I also never said naturalism of the gaps. I spoke about science of the gaps, which is different than naturalism of the gaps.
All right, my apologies. I would just replace whenever I said naturalism with science and use the same argument. So you said if it appears that nature can't, or naturalism can't explain it, therefore the supernatural, and that's a reasonable explanation.
Yes. If there is some particular phenomena that we are trying to observe and make sense of, and there is no way to make sense of it on any of the data provided by naturalism, then it seems reasonable to make an inference to some other explanation, which would be supernatural rather than natural. And under those circumstances, that seems reasonable.
And why would we prefer a supernatural as opposed to an unknown natural?
Because unknown things cannot do any explaining.
How is the supernatural any less unknown than the unknown natural?
Oh, the God that I worship is very much known by many people in this room.
I can just say the unknown natural is known. I feel it with my mind.
The unknown is known. Now you're speaking in contradictions.
Yeah, exactly. I believe you. That's from the atheist perspective. That's exactly what you're saying when you know God.
Well, no, it's not at all. You're claiming that I don't know God. I'm not making that claim. You are making a claim that there is something that is both unknown and known. I am in no way making a claim that the God that I know is both known and unknown. This is an important distinction between your position and mine.
All right, I apologize. So from the atheist position, there is no reason to believe in God, there's no evidence of a God, and you're claiming to know it, but there is no objective means to show it exists. Like, we can show gravity exists, we can show matter exists, but as far as I know, there is no equivalent for a God. So from the atheist perspective, you don't know of a God, you're just claiming to know of one, which would be equivalent to me saying, there is this unknown natural thing which I know of, from the atheist perspective.
Well, that might be the case, except you were the one, when presented with the question, might it be God? Could God possibly exist? Responded, absolutely. And then from the modal ontological argument, if God possibly exists, God exists of necessity.
Well, I didn't grant anything. If you ask me it's possible, I'm pretty much just going to say yes. Is it possible leprechauns exist? Sure, why not? So that's not really supporting your case. It's just that's how my epistemology works.
The modal ontological argument is the evidence that establishes for all rational, logical people that God exists of necessity. Now, if you want to deny the logic and be illogical, or if you want to deny the reason and be unreasonable, that's a different situation. But this is a settled matter.
Right, so I don't consider the modal ontological argument to be sound. It may be valid, but so are cats are dogs, dogs are chickens, therefore cats are chickens. We can make a valid argument that isn't sound, so I reject the truth of those premises.
But the entire modal ontological argument hinges on one premise. It's not a question of its validity, it is only a question of its soundness. And the soundness hinges on one and only one premise, and that is that it is possible that God exists. And you have already conceded, yes, it is possible, therefore it follows that God exists of necessity.
Right, and I regret that I reject that existence is a predicate. It's not. So you can't say that just because it's possible something exists, that it therefore exists. You're just defining it into existence. I can say there's a magic spaghetti monster that possibly exists. Is that evidence of the spaghetti monster? No. So saying that it's possible God exists is not a good reason to believe God exists, just like it's saying it's possible the spaghetti monster exists is not a good reason to believe in the spaghetti monster.
The tired and worn out charge, going all the way back to Kant, that existence is not a predicate, does not function in any way in the modal ontological argument that I've been defending for the last couple of years. And in the article that just got published this week, I make it quite clear that existence is not a predicate, and it functions in no way in any of the modal logic that's involved. Please try again.
I reject your paper, as do most philosophers.
Okay, most people reject climate change. So is that a good reason to reject climate change?
I don't believe most people do reject climate change, actually, but no.
Most people have never heard of climate change. There's 7 billion people on the planet. I mean, this is just silly. I don't see any point. So next question.
All right, so you brought up the Kalam cosmological argument. You said that's evidence of a God. That can be explained by a non-God, correct?
No, cannot.
How so?
Well, let's get clear. Are we talking about naturalistic pantheism here?
As one possibility, yes. That's probably what I'm going to go with.
So let's get all the possibilities on the table first, and then we'll whittle them down. So other than naturalistic pantheism, what other options would we want to put on the table as possible explanations of the data that we have from the Kalam cosmological argument?
Well, there's infinitely many due to the problem of underdetermination, so we could just list any. I would just go with whatever you want. Start with wherever you want.
Maybe you could explain for everybody how the principle of explosion is going to function in your saying that there's an infinite number of possible explanations for this.
Well, it's technically my question time, so I would not actually like to do that yet, but you can ask that.
Very good. Okay. So naturalistic pantheism certainly could not be an explanation for the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument establishes beyond any shadow of a doubt that the universe began to exist and was caused to begin to exist. Naturalistic pantheism is the thesis that the universe itself is divine in some sense. That's what the pantheism is. which is the difference between atheism and pantheism. I don't think that atheists, since the word theism is in there, believe in God, because is a negation. It means no God. Pan, on the other thing, means all. So pantheism is the idea that the entire universe is divine, that the universe itself is God. So it's very different in that sense. And if the universe itself is all that there is, which is what naturalism teaches, then the beginning of that universe has to be something that is external to that universe. You cannot appeal to something that is beyond the universe as the cause of the beginning of the universe if on naturalistic pantheism you're insisting that all that exists is the universe itself. The Kalam cosmological argument renders us to a place where we need something that transcends the universe to be the cause of all that there is.
All right, so two things there. One, naturalistic pantheism is not as you described it. You may have one version of that, but there are in fact three versions of pantheism.
That's from section 6 of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you reference. It's a throwaway line that uses this term, naturalistic pantheism. There's not a well-orbed discussion of what this is, but pantheisms in general are many, and they've been developed all the way back at least to Spinoza. Right, so you can't exclude my definition.
One of mine is the valid definition, valid interpretation, so just throw it away.
Which is what? What is your definition of naturalistic pantheism? Is there something beyond the universe?
So that's the second part of my rebuttal to what you just said. The universe refers to our universe, not all existing things in physics.
Very good. So I will talk about universe star. And what the Kalam cosmological argument is talking about is not just this particular world, but all that there is, and all of the infinites that are associated with that.
Okay, your examples of the evidence of the redshift only apply to our universe, not all universes. There's no evidence that all universes had a beginning, only ours.
That's correct. But the mathematical puzzles about the nature of infinity, if you think that numbers are necessary beings, as I do, and I think you do as well, then you don't think that numbers are necessary beings.
No, I think numbers are descriptions of what exists. I don't think numbers.
So do you think that there are universes where 2 + 2 = 7?
No, I think 2 + 2 = 7 is a description of a reality that exists. I don't think 2 + 2
But does that
7.
reality exist just in this universe or in all universes?
I think it's a description of the universes. It doesn't exist at all.
Okay, very good. So the description 2 + 2 = 4 that accurately describes
Actually, this is still
universe.
my question period, so I'd like to go back to that. There's only evidence that our universe began. All universes, there's no evidence they began. So in physics, there's things that can exist outside of our universe. There's many theories of multiple kinds of time, like Stephen Hawking's imaginary time, or Eitzelbar's two-time physics, or the block theory of time. So there's no problem with explaining the origin of the universe with physics without any reference to everything you just mentioned. So there's no problem in physics there at all.
So there'd be no problem in physics, but there would on numerous philosophical issues that are going to account for the impossibility of actual infinites. And actual infinites are to be distinguished between conceptual infinites or possible infinites, etc. We could talk about Cantor as well if you want.
Infinites aren't numbers, they're properties of sets. So saying there can't be an actual infinite is saying there can't be an actual x. You're never going to discover an x anywhere because it can't exist. So there's no real problem with that either.
Well, that's not entirely correct. The idea that there can be different values for infinity is certainly true, but it's not possible in your examples of x having a value of 4 and x having a value of 3. Once the value of some variable is set, it is set. It is not rational for in one and the same.
I was using two different x's there, so it would be x1 and x2. So in the case of the infinites, there could be one x like omega 1 and x or infinite 2 omega 2. They're two different sizes.
Very good, but those variables do pick out and reference specific numbers when they're indexed in that way, do they not?
Maybe.
So why wouldn't they? Well, I guess this is your question time, so.
So again, my point was that as far as I can tell, there's absolutely no contradiction in physics, and most physicists see no problem here of just saying that there could be something prior to the universe. So there's no evidence to suppose that there is some kind of a God there to explain this.
Right, and we get this from theoretical physicists, right?
Yes.
So we don't have any evidence for it.
Correct, but we have more evidence.
Good, no evidence for it. There we go.
It's a combination of things that can be verified in physics as opposed to yours, which is not, which means it's more reasonable to believe a priori.
I don't think that it's more reasonable to believe that which can be empirically verified than that which can be philosophically verified. I just don't buy that.
Could you explain that more?
Sure. We cannot empirically verify 2 + 2 = 4. You can provide example after example after example of bringing me 2 apples and 2 more apples and showing me that we have 4 apples. And then you can bring me another one that there's 2 pairs and 2 more pairs, and there you have 4 pairs. But you're never going to be able to prove that the conceptual 2 plus the other conceptual 2 = 4. These things are not scientific, they're philosophical, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe those even though they cannot be empirically verified.
Oh, I totally agree, but those are conceptual. I think the point of science is to differentiate between the imaginary or conceptual and what exists outside of our imagination. Numbers, from my perspective, are imaginary, so of course they're going to be conceptual and reasonable to believe for that reason. But if you say a God exists or that infinites or that other universes exist, you need science for that to show they're not imaginary.
No, you don't need science to show that God exists. Science doesn't have the resources to be able to. Science can only verify that which is empirically verifiable. And if God is not empirically verifiable, then science just doesn't have the resources to test for these kinds of equations. Science also doesn't have the resources to test for whether or not science is the best way to verify things. But that doesn't mean that science is unreliable because science cannot prove that science is itself reliable.
Again, that's a definitional thing. So science just shows the difference between imaginary and real, which is itself an imaginary conceptual principle, which is totally consistent with science. There's no contradiction there at all. You mentioned that, like, for example, why do you think that if you can't show a God exists empirically, how do you show it's not imaginary?
Modal logic.
Modal logic is imaginary, so using imaginary to show imaginary is circular.
Well, numbers are imaginary on your view, so how can you show that 2 apples plus 2 apples gives you 4 apples? It's just imaginary.
Correct. It's a description of the things that happen in the world.
Yes, and I think it's an accurate description of the things that happen in the world, in much the same way that the conceptual description of God and his nature is an accurate description of what happens in the world and what is responsible for the creation of all things.
But with the apples, we can actually show it in the world. With the God, we can't. That's why it's not reasonable.
Well, right, but with the numbers, you can't show them because they're conceptual, they're imaginary.
Well, then again, the numbers just describe reality. They don't exist, so that's totally fine. But you're saying the God exists, which you can't show.
But he doesn't exist in the universe. He's not part of the universe.
Right, so you need some way to show it exists and isn't imaginary.
But I don't need to show it scientifically.
Well, correct. Anything you can do to show it's not imaginary is good. How do you do it?
Modal logic.
That's imaginary. You're using this imaginary.
No, it's not imaginary. Like there are real things that are possible and not possible. Those are ontological realities.
Those are descriptions, so they're imaginary. So how do you actually show that God exists? Like the apples. I can show the apples. I can show they exist.
Okay, and the reason that those apples can exist is because they possibly exist. That's a description.
No, that's just...
But it points... No, so if the apples didn't possibly exist, then there would be no apples. That's what the nature of those descriptions mean. That is what the modal logic is. Modal logic is metaphysics. Timothy Williamson wrote the book on this.
Correct. I can describe it in that way, but that description is not... It's like a language, like English. I can say a tree exists, but I can also use Japanese. It's not the function of reality, modal logic. Modal logic is a language to describe reality.
Oh, sorry, it's my turn. Okay. So I don't know that I'm really going to need 15 minutes. I have a question for you. How could the cause of the universe not be a God? How could it be a non-God?
The multiverse can cause the universe, and it's not a God.
What caused the multiverse?
You didn't ask that. You asked what caused the universe.
Well, now I'm asking what caused the multiverse.
Multiverse is eternal.
Then you have the same problems of infinite regress there.
There's no infinite regress. I said it's internal. It's not infinite regress. The set of all things that entails the multiverse is itself eternal.
Okay, so it never came into being.
Correct.
And how does the multiverse cause this particular universe to exist?
I don't know. Physics?
Well, no, it can't be physics because the multiverse isn't physical. It's only the individual universes that collectively comprise the multiverse that are physical.
The laws that apply to the multiverse don't need to apply to particular universes. So they can apply like Hilbert space. They don't need to be physical in that sense.
So you acknowledge that there are certain laws that might apply at one level but not another level.
Absolutely.
So if that's okay for the multiverse, why is it not okay for God?
It could be okay for God. I wouldn't say
okay, so then there's really nothing wrong at all with me saying that matter and energy came into being, which you said is a violation of the first law of thermodynamics.
Correct. I would not say that's a violation. In fact, matter and energy could come about by natural causes.
Well, how could they?
By unknown natural causes.
Positing an unknown does not do any explanatory work.
Right, and I think your God does no explanatory work.
Well, you can think that. That's fine. I'm not categorizing what you're saying as something that couldn't be like maybe there's something
Let me
out
phrase
there.
it this way. I can give an arbitrary name to an unknown natural thing and then assign properties to it and say it does stuff. But instead of just doing that, I'm just going to call it unknown and say, we can all do that. And I think that's what you've done for God. And instead of just giving a particular name like the spaghetti monster, I'm going to say it's an unknown natural cause.
Well, I don't think that that's really going to work because you're still dealing with some of the same problems. And when you brought up the idea of the laws of thermodynamics, there are many issues at work here. Okay, one is a law of motion, that an object that's in motion tends to remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So if the universe is expanding,
I don't think that's one of thermodynamics.
excuse me?
There are 4 laws of thermodynamics.
I didn't say that was a law of thermodynamics. I said that it was a law of motion.
All right.
Okay? So if there is this law of motion, and if it is true that the universe is expanding and it is accelerating its rate of expansion, then you do acknowledge that that points to the idea that at least our universe began to exist,
Absolutely.
right? And you acknowledge that this universe could not have existed eternally, right?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's possible, but unlikely.
How could it have existed for eternity given the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy?
It only applies to closed systems. There might not be a closed system.
The universe might not be a closed system. Like it might be open to...
Other things that aren't the universe.
that sounds a lot like supernaturalism.
Or it could
That is the claim of theism.
No, there could be something that's outside of the universe which is natural. You're just assuming that it would be supernatural.
That's not naturalistic pantheism. Naturalistic pantheism is the idea that the universe itself is all that there is, and there is nothing outside of the universe. That is the definition of naturalistic pantheism,
You're conflating,
according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
You're equivocating between two different definitions of universe. In physics, universe only applies to our universe, not all things.
Well, that's what I said
So
about
again,
this
when I
particular
grant-
universe. How could this particular universe have existed eternally given the second law of thermodynamics?
The second
and you
law-
said it could be open to outside interference.
So our universe could have been influenced by something outside of our universe, which the second law doesn't apply to.
So you deny the causal closure of the universe.
Yes, I'd say our universe could have something outside of it which caused our universe. And that thing outside of it could have properties which the second law doesn't apply to.
As long as you deny the causal closure of this particular universe, I mean, this is a standard claim that theists make and atheists push back on all the time. So I'll take that. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Our universe had a beginning, so there must have been something that caused it.
Okay, and that cause must have been powerful enough to generate this universe, and eternal, and must have existed of necessity. Couldn't have failed to exist.
Depending on what you mean by those, yes, because there's lots of...
I mean standard modal logic necessity. Couldn't fail to exist. It's not contingent.
Like eternal could mean outside of space-time. It could mean existing throughout time. It could mean like a B-theory block time.
Oh, sure. Okay, so on the time stuff, I was talking about necessity. On the time stuff, eternality. Maybe block, maybe endurantism, maybe predurantism, maybe timelessness altogether.
Yeah, so that was...
Okay, that's a fair definitional qualification. But whatever this cause was had to be extremely powerful. And you've denied that this being that's responsible for the creation of the universe is necessarily personal. So I want to know, given that the universe came into being at some particular time and not at some other time, there's a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that would have obtained to generate this particular universe. And the fact that it happened at some time rather than some other time means that it couldn't have been accidental. Because if it had been accidental and there's some eternal cause in the background, then why didn't it happen at some other time? Why did it happen at this particular time? All of that gives us reason to think that it must have been a decision, an act of a will. And I don't know any beings that are extremely powerful and extremely intelligent and exist of necessity and are eternal and make decisions that are not like God. I just don't know any that meet that description.
Okay, so quantum particles have an infinite range of possibilities of when they could decay, and they decay at some point, so they must have a will. There's no other way to explain it. or they could be random, and they just decay randomly.
Or something else behind them has a will which causes them.
Or absolutely something else behind them could be random, or it could be determined. There's lots of ways to explain it without a will. So the same thing could apply to the universe. It could have popped into existence at some point and not another because of deterministic processes or random processes or will. But it doesn't indicate a will.
Right. So then the question is, if the universe was caused to begin to exist, what was that cause? Because my claim is that the cause must have made a decision to bring the universe about at this time and not some other time, at whatever the T0 was that was the Big Bang. Whenever that was, the fact that it happened at that moment and not at some other moment must have been the result of a decision that was made.
Right, and I'm using the example of quantum physics where there's a part where the particle decays at some time and not another time, but it's just random. There's no will behind it causing it, unless there could be, but as far as we know, there is none. And so that can be explained without a will, which means you can also apply it to the universe and say, hey, that could also have come about at some time and not another for some other reason that is not a will, like randomness.
So I don't buy it, and the main reason that I don't buy it is because we just have absolutely no reason to believe that the lack of causation that happens at the subatomic level in quantum mechanics is the same thing that happens at the exceedingly macro level of the birth of a universe. There's not a single instance in any science that demonstrates that that's a plausible interpretation at the macro level.
Those are literally the same thing. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics literally describe that. That's what it's for.
No, quantum mechanics describe things that take place at subatomic levels. The birth of the universe is not something that happens for everything that exists now, right? We're talking about the whole of all of it.
No, that was all at a subatomic level.
No, I understand that it was all compacted down at one level, but we're now talking about things that play out within the universe. I'm talking about when the universe didn't exist at all and came into being. That is a category mistake to say it's the same thing, because at one moment there was nothing, and at another moment there was something, and that something began to explode and expand. And for you to take all of the science that we know now as the universe exists and is continuing to expand and talk about what's happening at the subatomic level and say that all of that was at work when there was nothing at all is a category mistake.
Correct, because when it's not nothing at all, there was never nothing at all. Nothing in physics just means none of the
So the universe
stuff.
always existed.
Yes, we call it the cosmos.
Very good. All right.
Our universe had a beginning.
So now we have realized that Mr. Jump does not understand that the Kalam cosmological argument has established that the universe itself began to exist. Not that there was some cosmos that pre-existed and whatever. That's not the claim. That's not what the argument establishes.
Well, there's no evidence that the universe in that sense had a beginning at all. There's only evidence that our universe had a beginning. So the Kalam is only supported if it applies to ours.
I've only been talking about our universe. I've not talked about the multiverse unless I have used the word multiverse.
Correct. So when you say universe, and the Kalam and the evidence to support the beginning of the universe only supports the beginning of our physics universe. It does not support the beginning of everything. It does not say that everything had a beginning.
We have no reason to believe that anything outside of this particular universe exists at all on your understanding of things.
Including a God.
Well, on your view of things, yes. So you can't appeal to a multiverse that there's no evidence for
you
on your model of
appeal to
seeing
a God that there's no evidence for the same reason.
There's tons of evidence for God. There's so much evidence for God. And it's not just the Kalam cosmological argument or the modal ontological argument. There are arguments from beauty and arguments from consciousness and 24 or so arguments in the Plantinga project that we don't have time to discuss tonight. For you to say that there is literally no evidence for God just indicates that you're either willfully blind or you're just uninformed on the subject matter.
I've researched all of those and find them unsound. But there's more evidence of the universe because
you've
it's a combination
researched
of
all
physics.
of the arguments. Hang on, guys. I'm going to write down 3 arguments right here. He just said he's researched all of them. Here's the first one. What do you find problematic with the argument from moral knowledge?
I don't believe moral knowledge exists. It's just, moral knowledge is subjective. It doesn't exist as a fundamental objective part of reality.
So you don't believe in objective morality?
I do, but not in the sense of that argument, but that's more subjective to my particular.
I know your work on this, Mr. Jump. You do believe in objective morality, and you think that we can know right from wrong.
Correct.
You do think that we can have moral knowledge.
Correct.
So it's wrong for you to say that it doesn't exist.
I wouldn't use that as an objective to that argument.
What do you find problematic about Ted Poston's recent argument from so many arguments?
Because I find all of the other arguments to fail just as much as that one. So it's
But that's not what his argument is. His argument depends not on the success of any of those other arguments. So what do you find? You've
zero
examined
plus
all
zero
of
plus
the
zero
arguments.
plus zero is still zero.
Here's a hint. This is a good place for you to say, I misspoke. I have not investigated all of the arguments. I have dug around in my backyard. I did not find any gold, but it is not rational for me to therefore conclude that there's no gold in the entire state of Texas.
I have actually researched that argument. It's in Plantinga's book about, I think it's the 13 reasons or something.
It's the 24 or so
Two
reasons.
dozen or so reasons.
Yes. But it does not depend on the success of any of those other arguments, and that's what you just said you found to be problematic about that argument, is that I think all those other arguments are wrong, therefore this argument's wrong. But Ted's argument doesn't depend on the success of all those other arguments, so you fundamentally misunderstood it.
It's definitely possible.
Well, it's quite certain at this point.
Sure, maybe. Maybe you could explain it to me, and then I can find another wrong reason with it. Maybe it's so.
Maybe.
In fact, that
I'll
as far as
yield
to
the
the
rest of
best
my
of my
time.
knowledge, it's a justified belief that that argument fails. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, it's justified to believe it's false.
I definitely believe that you have a justified belief that it's a bad argument, but I think justification is really, really easy to get. I think everyone in the room who believes that God exists because the Bible says so is justified in believing that, which is why I believe that we have reason to believe in God. It's also why I believe we have very good reason to believe in God.
And you said three. You said you wrote down three?
I didn't get to the third, but I'd like to talk about the argument from beauty.
Okay.
What do you find problematic about the argument from beauty?
I don't believe beauty is a thing that exists, just like I don't believe hunger is a thing that exists. It seems like the argument argues that beauty is a thing that exists as a fundamental part of reality, like gravity or mass or energy, and that it's out there and there's an objective definition to it. To me, beauty is like hunger or tallness or bigness. It's just an adjective we use to describe things, so it doesn't actually apply.
Anybody in the room ever been hungry? Okay, hunger exists. No further questions.
So is it like an objective law of reality, or is it a subjective part of human brains?
It's objectively true that some people get hungry.
Right, I agree.
And the hunger exists in that person.
Right, so when I'm using objective and subjective, I mean like there's an objective thing called gravity that exists independent of human mind. So there is an objective thing called gravity, which exists independent of human mind.
No, that's just a description of the universe and the way that it works. It's not an objective thing. It's just conceptual.
Okay, science disagrees. I'm going to go with science on that one. But beauty it's contingent on mind.
On
so it's
your
subjective.
account of what things are, right? Gravity, or at least the gravitational constant, it's not a real thing. It's just a description.
Right, it describes something that exists in nature, but the constant itself doesn't exist. It's just like math.
And you don't think the numbers are real? That's right. So,
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So then it's not clear to me what kind of ontology you're working with if you want to say that hunger isn't real.
Well, no, I don't think hunger is an objective thing like gravity is. Hunger is a real thing in the fact that it's a product of our minds. But when I say objective, I mean something that exists independent of minds.
So are you a Berkeleyan immaterialist?
No.
We just don't have any reason to believe. I'm a Berkeleyan immaterialist, so I don't have any. This is not like a knock, but.
Well, I'd be like a methodological naturalist. I'd probably lean towards materialism.
Yeah, so we could talk about definitions of terms a little more. I think I'm out of time, but whatever ontology you're working with, if you can't say that hunger is a thing that exists, then we're parsing things in ways that it's not entirely clear to me what's going on. I want to acknowledge that if we want to just describe the state of desiring to eat food as hunger, and say that people objectively experience that thing, but they themselves are the subjects, so it is a subjective experience. But it is objectively real that they are having that subjective experience, right?
Yes. So I agree, hunger exists in that sense.
That's what I'm trying to point out.
So I'm saying, like, using a different example, tallness. There is no tallness that exists. We can describe things as tall.
That's the difference between primary and secondary properties.
Correct, and I would say beauty is
Fine.
the same thing. Beauty is like tallness.
Yeah, I think that there's an objective beauty.
Right, and that's what I was saying. There isn't a. That's what I'm saying is not the case. That's what I was trying to use.
So yeah, you disagree with that. Okay, so you get out of the argument from beauty. So there's no God on the argument from beauty at the cost of there's no such thing as beauty. Are you married?
No.
Yep, I know why.
All right, and with that, TJump, Dr. Ben Arbour. Let's give him a hand. We will segue now to that tasty portion called the Q&A from the crowd. I ask that your question be germane to tonight's topic. It be 2 minutes or less. Do not give a 10-minute diatribe. Then your question, at 2 minutes, your mic is muted, and you're just an animated freak on YouTube. Right here, Q&A. Let's begin.
Animated freaks on YouTube do well. Wow. Nobody. This is kind of a first. Okay, good. I was gonna say this is
Being early, this is not well formed. I'm not going to ask you any of the questions we were talking about earlier, but I'm really struggling. One of the things you just recently said is that you lean towards materialism, and so the only things that exist are things which are material, and yet you assert that the cosmos, which is I found this interesting, is it's a different definition of the universe. The cosmos, in your view, is eternal, and it is made up of things which are non-material, which have causal power, namely the laws of nature, which are not just descriptions of nature, but are causally powerful dictates which nature obeys, and that seems very inconsistent with materialism. So my question is, can you help me make sense of what seems to be contradictions in what I just heard you say?
Sure. In physics, those things, the probability waves, are still technically material. So all of that physics stuff that doesn't really seem like it's material, it still is. But it's just in probability form or wave form and not in like a packet particle form, but it's still material.
So the cosmos, the stuff that's beyond the universe but part of the multiverse, that's also non-physical but material?
It would still fit into the branch of materialism as described by physics, yes.
How would that what is material substance then?
I've no idea how to best explain that.
But it's not physical. So there can be material substances that are not physical.
Possibly, yeah, like in particle waves,
not possibly.
probability waves.
I mean, you're pointing to this not just as a possibility, but as what actually explains the existence of the universe.
Correct, like in physics and particle waves and things that haven't collapsed yet, all things, we have no idea how they work, but those would still fit into the category of material in materialism. But since materialism is a philosophical thing, trying to translate that into physics is difficult.
A quick question for Tom. This is regards to the moral argument you were making. You were saying like any world you can imagine can always be made more moral just simply by being given the choice to choose that world, correct?
Yes.
So my question is, it seems like you have to already exist in the first place in order to be given free choice. So isn't that kind of shooting yourself in the foot? Like, of course you have free choice. You had no choice in the matter in the first place.
Well, is it really done?
And just a little second part is, it seems also that to have a choice to choose a particular world, you also need to have some sort of background, some sort of life experience. Where are you going to draw from in order to make that choice in the first place?
Right, so God could have created us outside of the world and given us the option to go into this world or go into a different world. I don't see any moral problem with him creating us, but the problem is when he forces us to be in a particular world we had no say in with involuntary suffering. So him just creating us, totally okay with that, not immoral. Not giving us the option to choose a different world, that's the immoral part. And what was the second part of your question?
As long as you had no choice to begin with.
Oh, right. So we need background knowledge. God could give us background knowledge. It's like we can just download it into our brains, just give us background knowledge. We don't actually need to experience it to have it.
Once you exist, it's too late. You already exist. Whether you're in this realm that's pre-choosing your world, you already exist at that point with no choice to choose to exist.
Right, that's the immoral part. So he could make us exist outside of the world and then give us knowledge, and then we can choose which world we want to be in.
So no matter what, it's like
No, slavery is when you don't have the choice. So if you create us and then give the choice, that's fine.
You have no choice to be created but free choice.
That's totally fine. So as long as he doesn't force us into a world without our consent, that's fine. Just
something that I thought was interesting was something you said earlier about, and I was just kind of interested in a follow-up real quick to something that you said regarding will. Like, why is it necessary with the cosmological argument and the universe supposedly having a beginning for anything that theoretically came before that beginning to have a will? Isn't that just inserting something that, I mean, everything that we've seen of consciousness is that it's very complex, and something that builds something as intentionally and intelligently as our universe would be extraordinarily complex. So why is I don't understand how inserting a God with will who created the universe solves any problems. It seems like it creates a whole new larger problem with the classic question, who created God? And if God just existed just because and uncreated, that inserts something that's far more complex. When we could just have something that's a lot simpler and not put the very complex variable of will into the equation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Might take me a minute to respond, to at least first explain how the kalam works, then why the will is important, and then how it solves the infinite regress problem, or the who created God problem. So the kalam points not only to scientific reasons for believing that this particular universe began to exist, but also to mathematical and philosophical reasons for believing that there could not have been anything that has existed for an actually infinite duration at all, ever. Now, God is not thought to exist in duration. God is timeless. He exists outside of time and outside of space, okay? And positing God as the cause of this as opposed to a multiverse, the multiverse has to exist eternally, and eternally there means for not timelessly. Now, the idea of a will being important in the creation of the universe has to do with necessary and sufficient conditions. And the easy way that I teach this in kind of intro to philosophy, stuff about causation, is if you think about fire, okay? Fire requires at least three things. You have to have oxygen, you have to have a fuel source, and you have to have a heat source. The existence of oxygen all by itself is a necessary condition for fire, but it doesn't get you fire, right? There's oxygen in the room. The atmosphere is not on fire. The existence of a heat source all by itself doesn't get you fire because you don't necessarily have a fuel source and an oxygen source. You need all three of these together at the same time. But if the universe that we live in is the accidental outcome of something where all of the necessary and sufficient conditions just bumped into each other at some random permutation and gave birth to the universe, and that happened out of an eternal thing, then we have this question as to why did it happen at the moment of the birth of this particular universe, where it happened, as opposed to eons later or eons earlier or whatever. Because if there's an eternal forever in which the multiverse has existed, where all of those necessary and sufficient conditions could have randomly bumped into each other at some other time, then why didn't they? But the fact that the universe did begin to exist at this particular moment, it's from an Occam's razor standpoint, just easier to say, well, there was a decision that was made to create the universe at this moment and not some other moment. And that doesn't lead to a turtles all the way down paradox, because God is, he's the unmoved mover, right? He's not a contingent thing. The universe is contingent. Contingent things are explained by other contingent things or by a necessary thing. God is the necessary thing that serves as the backstop. So who made God is not a coherent question. So there's a lot there, but That's how all that works on the Kalam.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, follow up.
Or what's that? Just go? Go ahead. Okay. All right. So the decision, why, I don't understand, first, why a decision has to be made, why it can just be something that doesn't have will, that just happen. Like, how are you, I guess to summarize, how does will get rid of the turtles all the way down? Like, how does inserting will, it seems like you have the same problem whether you insert will or take will out as far as the turtles all the way down.
What caused it was a decision. God decided. Now, if you want to ask what the cause of that decision was, well, I don't know why God decided. I mean, there's a mystery there. So I'm happy to concede that, if that's what we're driving at.
First of all, I want to say thank you, Mr. Jump and Dr. Arbour, and to Ezra and World of Beer. I think if this is a sign of hope for our society, that we can carry on this conversation in a place like this with the civility that has been demonstrated. And so that's just massive thank you going on for that. And my question is for both of you. Ben, you didn't really discuss the issues of historicity and Christianity very much. And Tom, how does science apply to the historicity of the resurrection of Christ? It seems to me that something in the first century AD Palestine happened that was very unique, that altered world history. Being kind of an amateur historian, I really value the historical approach, and how does science interact with that?
Sure. So there's this quote I like to use from Mike Licona. He's a Christian historian, rather famous one. Most biblical historians, biblical scholars and historians hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. What that means is that history can't verify miracles. Essentially, if I told you I saw a dog, that's reasonable to believe. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that's not reasonable to believe. The difference between these two claims is that dogs already have an empirical basis. We can scientifically verify a whole bunch of stuff about dogs. We know they exist. So if I said I saw one, that's reasonable. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that's not reasonable until it also has the empirical evidence behind it. History applies the same way. So no amount of testimony from historical examples are going to justify things that don't have an empirical basis, which means miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs. So none of those can be verified by history alone. You would also need some kind of an empirical basis to justify those to go along with the testimony that they exist from a historical example.
But history pretty much does verify something unique happened in the first century that altered Jewish history, that altered Roman history. How do you explain that?
It's not unique. It happens all over the world. In fact, the fastest growing religion was Falun Gong, which was in China. Mormonism grew at approximately the same rate of Christianity. There are many examples of it happening throughout history. It's not unique.
Yeah, so I'm a fan of Dr. Gary Habermas's work. He has a minimal facts case for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, which I affirm, right? I affirm all the main tenets of historic Christian orthodoxy. Like my friend Nick Peters, he always says, and I affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm. That's his line. I think it's fun. Just to make it clear, I also affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm. But on the historicity question, I actually think there's something important that although I affirm the historicity of the resurrection, there are things that I don't think history can get you that are essential to the historical facts in the way that they're tied to Christianity. So history can get you that Jesus was crucified. I don't think history can get you that he shed his blood for our sins, okay? I think history can get you the resurrection. I don't think history can get you that he was raised for our justification. So I want to acknowledge that there are limits in the way that history does and does not work for the Christian faith. But I do think that minimal facts thesis supports the historicity of the resurrection of Christ.
Good deal. Thank you.
I was, for Tom, Mr. Jump, I heard this briefly mentioned during the debate, but didn't really catch if there's much more after that. Do you believe in a objective morality And if you do, what is the basis for that?
I do, but it's the basis for that is the best of all possible worlds, the best way the world could be, which is a world where all actions are consensual. You can't force anybody to do anything against their will. To me, that is the basis of objective morality.
Okay. Follow-up question. So follow-up question, how would you know anything could be better if you did not have some idea of a better morality or of a better world that could possibly exist?
I'm not sure what you mean, but if we take two examples, like for example, if I give person X the option to do something, like eat an apple, you have the option to eat an apple, that is always going to be more moral than if I force them to eat the apple. So if they have the option to do it, it's always morally superior than if they don't have the option. If we just apply that universally, we always give them the option, it's morally superior.
I disagree, because what if the option is this apple will cure them of some disease that they will die of, as opposed to if they don't eat the apple, they will die.
It's still moral to give them the choice. They should have the choice.
Is it still a more moral choice to... I would think it's a more moral choice to make them eat the apple so that they would be able to live.
Right, that would be totally immoral. They should have the option. It's always more moral to give them the option.
All right. Agree to disagree.
Question for Ben this time, if I can formulate it after 4 beers. So, lightweight, what can I say? You made a comment earlier about the scientific method not being able to...
Aaron Summerhill calls himself a lightweight. I've worked out with this guy. He's not a lightweight.
You made a comment earlier about the scientific method not being able to be applied to itself as some way to kind of undermine or discredit the scientific method as a source for knowledge or truth, I guess. So a question is, if we're making like an Excel worksheet and we plug in a formula and then we try to apply that formula to itself, a circular reference error comes up. But that circular reference error does not imply or does not dilute the integrity of the formula itself. So how would that same thing be? Why would it be the case for scientific method, anyways?
So there's some important differences here. I don't think that I said that the scientific method. I think I was talking about science itself. And my point here, I like science. I'm not an anti-science guy, but I think that science and the scientific method itself depends upon philosophical axioms that are underneath it. There are more fundamental claims about the nature of truth, the idea of discoverability, what it means to know something, how we could go about testing things that precede science. And I don't necessarily mean that they precede them temporally. I mean, when we go about doing logic, when we learn the scientific method, at least as I learned it, we're going to formulate a hypothesis, we're going to design an experiment to test that hypothesis, we're going to conduct the experiment, we're going to record our observations, we're going to repeat the experiment, record our observations, repeat the experiment, record, and then eventually either confirm or disconfirm our original hypothesis. Keep doing that until you either confirm or disconfirm a scientific theory. You know, when I learned all this stuff in grade school, I had already learned stuff like the difference between truth and error. But science didn't teach me that there's truth and error. That was all stuff that came not through any formal instruction in philosophy, but when you actually think about it, it is philosophy. We're all philosophers first, and then we turn our attention to the sciences or to something else. So the claim is not that science in and of itself is bad or is unreliable or something like that. The claim is that science qua science, and science is the only rational basis for knowing anything, that is problematic. Because science can't get you to the place of believing that science is the only reliable way of knowing anything. That's not a scientific claim. That's a philosophical claim about what constitutes a basis for knowledge and what counts as a legitimate source for epistemological justification. That's the point I'm trying to make there.
And I totally agree on that. It's the scientism, the belief that only science is the valuable way of knowledge, is completely unreliable. I would never support that position.
Hey guys, thanks for the discussion.
Eric.
Hey, Tom and Ben. Both good to see you guys. This is kind of a question for each of y'all independently, just kind of for clarification. Tom, would you be willing to admit that you have to concede the debate that while you don't think there are good reasons to believe in God, there are nonetheless reasons to believe in God? And then Ben, given that Tom has said that absolutely God might exist, should he actually have to go as far and equally conclude that therefore God does in fact exist?
All right, so when I say reasons, I mean good reasons. If you say a reason and it's just something you made up, I would not qualify that as a reason. If it's not reasonable, it's not a reason. So just saying, well, the Bible says so, I wouldn't even classify that as a reason. It's just nonsense. So when I say you need reasons to believe in a God, they would be in, as Dr. Arbour phrased it, good reasons.
So you're not making a distinction between mere reason and good reason?
Right, because when I say reason, it requires them to be reasonable for them to be reasons.
Yeah, so on that point, I think that there can be reasons that don't get us to a point of being confident in our belief, but they still serve as reasons, right? So instead of the 6-sided die example from Trent Doherty, let's just imagine that we have a 100-sided die, okay? And somebody rolls the die, and I just guess that it's going to be 14. And somebody says, hey, I just checked and the number is below 50. Does that give me reason? Yes. Does it give me enough reason to be confident? No. But I just think that's the way that evidence works on a Bayesian approach to evidence. It's more likely that the hypothesis is true than not, given the evidence that I have now in comparison to the evidence that I had before. Same thing if somebody comes back to me and says, hey, the number is under 25. My credence just went up a little bit more. It is evidence, it is a reason. Still doesn't get me to the point where it's rational for me to bet my paycheck on it. But I just think it's silly to say that that's false, because even in that instance, it is a good reason.
Right, I'd agree with that if you don't mind me interrupting.
Sure, no.
So when I say a reason, I mean it makes the likelihood that God exists more than it doesn't exist, by any amount. I don't care about the amount. So when you say the Bible says so, to me the amount that raises the likelihood God exists is exactly 0. So when I define reasons,
it's not even possible to you that the Bible is true?
It's possible, but it raises me to 0.
Okay, so here's where we are on this, right? If it is not possible that the Bible is true, if it is impossible that the Bible is true, and someone makes an argument, I believe in God because the Bible says so, then the credence on that would be 0. But if it is even possible that the Bible is true, and someone says, I believe in God because the Bible says so, then your credence ought to be at least just this little teeny tiny bit higher than it was before.
Right, but remember, when I find reasons, I'd say it has to be reason for a God more than not a God.
Well, if the Bible is possibly true, that would be God and not some non-God.
Correct, but it's equally likely it's not true.
Well,
so the
no.
probability for both is the same there.
I don't think you're understanding how the Bayesian probabilities are working here. Because I'm not saying that it gets you to a 50% threshold or to a 75% threshold. I'm just saying that it raised it a little bit. And if it raises it even a little bit, then that's evidence. And evidence is not just a reason, but a good reason. It's not a definitive reason. It doesn't give you Cartesian certainty, but it's a good reason.
Right, I'm saying that's still 0 for me.
So then you don't think it's possible that the Bible is true?
No, I think it is possible, but that's
then
not evidence.
Then you don't understand how the formulas are working.
It's possible the spaghetti monster exists. That's not
what about
evidence
the question that I asked to you? Do you think he should concede the debate, and should he at least go further and say that, given he says it's possible God exists, should he go further and concede that in fact God does exist?
So I think that terms like maybe God exists or possibly God exists or it could be the case that God exists, or all those things are semantically equivalent. And I think that if you concede that point, that it is possible that God exists, then God does in fact exist of necessity. To deny that is to deny S4 of modal logic, and there just doesn't seem to be any rational basis to do that. So it seems to me that in light of the success of various articulations of the modal ontological argument, the only way to avoid the force of the conclusion that God exists of necessity is to deny the premise that possibly God exists. But Mr. Jump has on numerous occasions said that it is possible that God exists. So there we go.
Just to clear up what he was saying, so like he said on the 100 die, if he guesses 14 and somebody says it's less than 50, that would increase the evidence, but you say it does not.
No, it does. That does, but it's not reason. So for that,
I have a reason to believe it is 14 because they did just tell me it's less than 50.
Evidence. Yes, that is reason. but the Bible said so is not reason. So that isn't like there's the number is less than 50. That's if we roll a 100-sided die, the Bible says so. It's still there's zero chance that it has any reference to what the dice actually does. So it could, it may not. It just tells us nothing on the dice. So if we have a book that says, well, the dice rolled less than 50, like we have no reason to trust the book actually corresponds to the dice. So it's zero evidence of what the dice actually rolled.
Okay. And to clear up some terms, I believe the speaker called you an atheist. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is that what you would label
Yes.
yourself as? Okay. So atheism is a lack of belief in God. And you use the example of something 2 pounds in a box. And several times you said, we don't know the cause of the universe. We don't know what's in the box. It could be anything. But an atheist would say the 2 pound thing in the box is not God. And I believe that. An agnostic would say, I don't know, which is what you said. So why do you label yourself an atheist?
Because most atheists use the definition and not in that sense. So the definition you're using comes from the more philosophical, strict definition, which
You don't believe there's a God.
correct. The philosophical definition is God does not exist. But most atheists define it as I have no reason to believe in a God. And the reason that this is not agnosticism, the difference between agnosticism, is that modern atheism takes the position that it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. Anything. If you just assert there is a tribble that exists, it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So the default position is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise, which is why we're atheists, because we think it's just imaginary. And until you provide evidence, we have positive reason to believe it's imaginary and not real, and there's no reason to believe it is real, simply because there's no reason to believe it.
Okay. And the last thing you said, if someone does not have the option to do something, it's more immoral than making them do it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if your objective morality was it's okay to rape and murder a child, and somebody made you not do it, I agree, everybody would think that's a good decision. Do you think it's more immoral for somebody to stop you doing that than to not?
There's two people there. So you can't do anything to anyone else without their consent. That's always immoral no matter what. So you have to take it out.
Okay, to rob someone.
Yeah, it's always immoral to ever force anything on anyone ever.
Like forcing someone to pay taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. Taxes are theft.
Are all laws immoral then?
Yes.
I like that though.
Yes.
All laws are immoral.
Yes, the best
so
of all.
do not murder, do not steal, do not kill, do not anything. Any laws in Scripture or laws that we have in Texas are immoral.
If we lived in the best of all possible worlds, as I described as my basis of morality, where it's impossible to force someone to do anything without their consent, the laws are pointless. So the laws only exist because we don't exist in the best of all possible worlds. And so we have to impose limitations on some people, like putting them in prison, to protect other people. It's not right to put them in prison. It's not the best world that we could do that, but it's the best we can do given our situation. So I would say it would be a better world if we just couldn't ever hurt anyone or do anything without their consent. And then laws would be immoral to impose involuntarily because there's no reason to impose them.
So a law against raping a girl is immoral?
Only in the best of all possible worlds.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the questions was you had talked about, do we have reason to believe that there is a God? And then it became, do we have good reason to believe that there is a God? Good in this sense is a very subjective term depending on who is going to define that. And so would you be willing to concede that applying good defeats your argument?
No. So again, whenever I say reasons, it has to be good reasons or it's not a reason. And good, I'm agreeing with Dr. Ben's definition of good. Anything that raises the probability by any amount at all that it's more likely God exists than does not exist is evidence. I qualify that. That's a good reason. So it is a reason. But my contention is that all the arguments he presented, the biblical evidence, the fact that the Bible says so, amounts to exactly nothing. Zero.
So the other side, I feel like science is in many ways stumbling into what God created and what God wrote into His creation. In one of those ways, the creation of the heavens and the earth, just in the way that it was written in Genesis, the sequence of those things, and if you guys could both expand on sort of what that may mean to each of you, whether that means nothing or whether that means something to you in those sequences, and the way that science has kind of put those things in a very similar order, but perhaps timing being differently than what science would identify that as, and how you guys reconcile those two things. Something that was written thousands of years ago compared to what science has come upon recently, and then for Dr. Armour, just in the way that you kind of reconcile time and the way that those things work out.
I'll start with that. The order of Genesis is completely wrong. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I believe the earth was created before the sun in Genesis, which is not the case. And there's a whole bunch of problems with this, the order of Genesis and the creation story. It does not in any way conform to science at all. You'd have to vaguely interpret it in lots of different twisted ways to get it to conform with science.
Yeah, so, hang on just a second. Pardon me. So with respect to the question about what counts as a good argument, I do think that this is a little bit subjective. We always get to ask the really fun question, by what standard, are we going to determine what's good or not good? I don't think that you have to have reasons to be rationally justified to believe in God. And I think that there's a subjective dimension to this as well. Like, why do I believe in God? Well, at least one of the reasons is it sure seems like God exists. I think that's a good reason that at least raises the probability for me. I'm not saying that raises the probability for Mr. Jump, but it raises the probability for me. Arguments from religious experience. I've had very significant religious experiences in my life. My friend David, who you're sitting right next to, we've talked about these before. It's not something that I would just make up right now in order to defend the idea that I think God exists. But at least for me, those religious experiences raise the probability that God exists. And to me, they raise it to just such a high level that it's irrational to not believe in God for me. I'm not saying that makes it the case for Mr. Jump, who says that he has not had those religious experiences. So I get that. With respect to creation and those things, I think that what Christianity really insists upon is that God created all things. That there was not, and then there was. And God is the one who's responsible for that. Whether the earth is 10,000 years old or a gazillion trillion years old, I do not think Christianity hinges on those things. I do not think that this or that particular interpretation of the book of Genesis demands this or that reading, and if you reject that reading, then you reject the authority of Scripture. I don't buy into that stuff. There are plenty of people who think that, and there are some people who think that who I take to be reasonably intelligent. I'm not persuaded by their arguments, though, so it's not really interesting to me. The more interesting stuff is just whether or not God is responsible for the creation of all that there is, God alone accepted.
Hi. So you've said over and over during this debate that claiming that God, that just saying that it's a possibility for God to exist is proof that God exists. And you said that if someone acknowledges that it's possible, then it raises the possibility. But doesn't that just mean that the reason has to be justified for that to happen? Otherwise, it's just your opinion?
So I want to be clear about this. I did not say that saying that it is possible that God exists brings it about that God exists. What I said is, if someone acknowledges that it is true that possibly God exists, and that's a different thing, because one is just somebody spouting off their opinion. Another is someone testifying of what they believe is a true ontological reality. So here's the way that the argument works. If it is possible that God exists, then what we are claiming is that there exists a possible world. Might not be this one, might be some distant other possible world. That's a maximally consistent state of affairs. And at that world, a maximally great being exists in that world. But if a maximally great being, so I said in that world, I should have said at that world. If a maximally great being exists at that world, and that's all that we mean when we say it's possible that God exists, we're saying there is at least one possible world at which a maximally great being exists. But a maximally great being is not a contingent being. A maximally great being is a being that exists of necessity. And necessary beings don't exist at only one world. Necessary beings exist at all worlds. So if there is one world at which a maximally great being exists, that maximally great being exists at this world. And that maximally great being is God. So I think that is the correct way to think about modal logic. I think that's the right way to map out conceptually the whole landscape of the entire realm of possibilia. There's a whole long literature on this, on modal metaphysics and modal logic, and that's as much time as I have right now to get into it, but there's a long literature on that, and what I said in that is not controversial. All philosophers will agree. The ones that don't aren't going to follow the argument because they're not going to get on at the very first part. They're not going to be willing to concede that it is possible that God exists. But Mr. Jump does concede that it's possible. That's not just his opinion. He's making a claim about an ontological reality. He is saying, when he says that it is possible that God exists, that there exists at least one possible world in which a maximally great being exists. If he doesn't mean that, then he needs to spell out for us exactly what he does mean when he says it's possible that God exists.
Just a quick clarifying, is it possible in S5 logic to believe it's possible God exists and it's possible God does not exist, or maximally great being?
No.
I believe both.
Then you believe a contradiction.
I don't believe in S5 logic.
But you don't have to believe in S5 logic in order to follow the modal ontological argument as I just laid it out. All you need is S4 and accessibility relations between worlds.
It seems pretty obvious that it's more rational to believe it's possible God exists and it's possible God does not exist. So it seems like something in your argument may be begging the question, but that's a different topic.
In a recent piece, I defended the idea that we don't have any good reason for believing that negative existentials are possible unless we have evidence for them. We do have reasons to default towards possibility for positive existentials, but we might want to discuss that. It's pretty technical. We'll discuss that later.
Thank you, gentlemen. We conclude now with closing statements. Mr. Jump.
It was a great debate. I really enjoyed it. Thanks again for all you guys coming out. Thanks for Ben. Great time talking with you, dude. A big good friend of mine. We get it. We grill each other all the time, but it's great. Thanks for the Bible Beer Consortium for hosting. You guys are awesome. I think that I still believe that there are no reasons to believe in a God, and by reasons I do mean good reasons, that just anything that increases the likelihood exists. I don't think there are any, and I've researched as much as I can to find them. Now, I grant his position. I can't prove there are none. There could be out there and I just haven't discovered them, but I'm going to try and make the burden of proof as low as possible for theists. You just got to provide me one. Show me it works and I'll admit I'm wrong and I'm stop being an atheist. And so from my position, there are no good reasons to believe in a God. And that's really it.
Tom Jump. Dr. Arbour.
So thanks again to everybody for coming out. Thanks to the BBC for putting this on. One of the things I really appreciate about Tom is that he can give it and take it. There's a lot of people who don't really like to get into the rough and tumble, and he definitely does. And I think it makes for a more helpful conversation. Obviously, Tom and I disagree here. I do think that there are reasons to believe in God. I think there are bad reasons to believe in God. I think there are good reasons to believe in God. And I think that I demonstrated that there are at least some reasons that if we were going to think about them carefully in a Bayesian framework about raising the likelihood of something being true, should work even for Tom. I don't know that they would raise his credence very much at all. Maybe they'd get him from somewhere in 0 to somewhere in like the 0.0001% range. But I'm hopeful that we could discuss that a little bit more about why at least some of those on the possibility premises should raise the credence level at least a little bit and therefore count as evidence, even if it's not enough to move you. Nonetheless, I'm thankful that we got to have a good discussion. I'm grateful that we live in a land where we can still have these conversations without people throwing punches and throwing other stuff. I don't know. But, yeah, we got a lot to be thankful for. So, thanks.
Dr. Ben Arbour.